Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks as always for your time. This month we've seen events and publicity that could change perceptions about who will play what roles in Artemis in the future. But when will reality catch up to this potential? Blue Origin's New Glenn just completed a fully successful test flight on its second launch and announced the next evolution of the vehicle that would bring it into the Super Heavy Lift class of rockets. So that's now on the horizon with SpaceX's Starship as a replacement for the government's SLS rocket. As I've said about Starship, the big picture question is when, not if. The Starship and New Glenn architectures and designs promise to replace SLS, which may only fly 3 times this decade. But the question for either of the replacements is when will they demonstrate that capability? As an example, the SLS upgrade itself, the Exploration Upper Stage, hasn't yet demonstrated the promise to replace the current version of the rocket. Congress may change its mind or be convinced to change its mind, but otherwise they may continue to wait until those Starship and New Glenn capabilities are a demonstrated reality, and continue to sustain SLS until there's an operational replacement. The second lunar landing race with China that Congress wants to win already depends on those rockets reaching their potential before this decade is out. A second race is obviously another question of when, and it is not just framed as a race against China, but also against the calendar, with only a few years left in the rest of this presidential term and the decade. In the meantime, NASA still has reaching to the moon with Artemis II as its highest priority, and we're still looking for a little more clarity that a February launch remains on the table. NASA Public Affairs published an update on Artemis II launch preparations on Thursday, November 20th. This is the first detailed update since the last day of September, just prior to the 6-week-long government shutdown. NASA reopened, so to speak, on November 13th, so it's been about 7 weeks between updates. Orion was stacked on SLS in the Vehicle Assembly Building about a month ago on October 18th, and since then Exploration Ground Systems Integrated Operations has completed 2 of the 3 full-stack integrated tests prior to the final pre-rollout work. A graphic showing some of that testing at a high level was updated with the completed testing checked off. After Orion was mated to SLS, the Orion Service Module umbilical on the mobile launcher was connected, along with working connections between the spacecraft and the rocket. Interface testing of the OSMU connections are step 5 here on the graphic. The Integrated Interface Verification Test, shown as number 4 here, verifies the connections between Orion, SLS, and the mobile launcher. Then a communications end-to-end test was completed. That is number 3 on the graphic. That leaves 2 milestones on this graphic, the countdown demonstration test, part 1 of that, and installation of the Flight Termination System Ordnance, which is preceded by an FTS end-to-end test. But that leaves a lot of details and work to do, because that last step on this list can't be performed until the vehicle is ready to roll out for launch. Pretty much everything else needs to be completed. All the other vehicle closeouts, flight battery installations, thermal protection system detailing on the exterior, and some VAB platform retractions. The update doesn't address the big question though, given that the better part of 2 months has elapsed since the last one, which is whether the launch period at the beginning of February is still on the table or not. The official launch date, which is something that is submitted to Congress for this launch because it is the culmination of the development phase for Orion, is no later than April. However, it is just the current commitment date and has been delayed in the past. As launch preparations get closer to those rollout preparations, we're watching to see if there's enough time left to finish those for February, or if NASA will need another month and early March is going to be when the vehicle is ready to roll out and launch. In other words, unofficially or informally, is it early February or early March? Or something else? The update says that the first part of the countdown demonstration test will be conducted in the coming weeks, and it kind of confirms what Artemis Launch Director Charlie Blackwell Thompson said back in late September, which was that there would be a Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 will be a dry dress rehearsal of the launch day timeline while Orion and SLS are in the VAB. With the vehicle now fully stacked and integrated, the launch team and flight crew can run through the timeline again, and this time they can step through all the cabin ingress procedures with the closeout crew. After that, they would continue with countdown procedures, doing communications checks with Mission Control in Houston and the launch team in the Launch Control Center using the flight equipment. Then the closeout crew will close the crew module and launch abort system hatches, leak check the suit loops and leak check the crew compartment, and then the dry dress will run through the rest of the terminal countdown, all the way down to a simulated cutoff just before liftoff. That's several hours of launch day to go from suiting up, getting into their suits and hooking up to their suit umbilicals, and running through the rest of the countdown. Part 2 of the CDDT exercise would be performed at the pad after rollout. By that time, the emergency egress system will be fully hooked up to the mobile launcher, and the crew can run through a high-fidelity emergency egress exercise, presumably all the way from being in their seats inside Orion, opening the hatches, getting out and making their way over to the slidewire baskets on the opposite side of the umbilical tower. Now the questions are about whether that Part 2 exercise will be in late January ahead of a first launch attempt in February, or whether that second part of CDDT will be in late February ahead of the March launch period. Scott Manley had close-up imagery of all 4 of the fully installed strakes that are bolted into the structure of the SLS core stage intertank. Installation and closeouts of the thermal protection system coatings around them was completed during the government shutdown. The strakes are positioned on either side of each forward attach point between the SLS boosters and core stage. That is shuttle-era hardware, and in the transonic region of flight during the Artemis I launch, higher than predicted vibrations were recorded. The issues were classified as in-flight anomalies after the mission, and the strakes were the option chosen by the SLS program to address the vortex issue. Scott's video goes into some of the wind tunnel testing and analytical modeling done at Ames Research Center in Northern California to evaluate the issue and how the strakes performed in the wind tunnel. I included a link to his video if you haven't already seen it. During the week, NASA Public Affairs also opened media accreditation for the Artemis II launch. It's kind of a meta thing since there is no date attached yet, but it's expected to be a big event within the industry at least, and there should be a lot of media in attendance at the launch. I submitted my application, but that high turnout means that slots are going to be limited, and NASA has to consider bang for the buck. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. On Friday afternoon, November 21st, Artemis II Commander Reed Weissman posted the crew update on Instagram and provided some additional detail. The post and the video notes that the countdown demonstration test, the dry dress rehearsal part, had been scheduled for this past week, and the crew had been planning to be at KSC. However, the CDDT was delayed until December. He spoke to that and the obvious schedule question right at the top.
It's been kind of an interesting week because we were supposed to be at Kennedy Space Center for countdown demonstration test, but we have delayed that test into December. It won't affect our launch schedule, which is fantastic.
So we'll have to see if we get any additional color about the integrated operations schedule, either next week right before Thanksgiving, or maybe more likely after the holiday at the very beginning of December. If the February launch period is still on the table, EGS will need to be ready to press into final rollout preps not long after the year-end holiday fortnight, right after New Year's. And the vehicle will need to roll out to the pad around mid-January. This was a hypothetical calendar based on a very tentative February 5th date, an 18-day pad flow, and a flurry of activity in the 2 weeks ahead of rollout. Those are some of the puzzle pieces we heard from NASA officials in the past few months, and we'll just have to see when we get a more direct update on what work is left and whether they can juggle some of that to fit it around CDDT Part 1 later in December. After acting NASA Administrator, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy revealed that SpaceX recently told NASA that Starship HLS would be ready for Artemis III at the end of 2028, Audrey Decker published news for Politico and on social media about a tentative high-level schedule that she obtained. 3 dates are provided which correspond to the critical in-space demonstrations needed by NASA and Artemis III to complete the crewed lunar landing. The schedule put the ship-to-ship propellant transfer demo in June 2026, the uncrewed lunar landing demo a year later in June 2027, and the crewed lunar landing demo in September 2028. This begins to provide some context, but for the most part we're again seeing crucial information leaked to the media rather than provided in public by NASA or SpaceX. It gets to the basic question of why change plans or consider changing plans now. All we've heard in public is that Starship is late for the official Artemis III target date of mid-2027. If Starship was behind schedule, then the obvious question is how late? Secretary Duffy's comment on a recent Sean Ryan Show podcast episode, and now this report from Politico, start to provide some context to the situation. The last joint confidence level forecast was done 2 years ago as a part of the Key Decision Point C review, and that had already projected this specific Starship, the HLS Option A version, would reach the lunar orbit checkout review milestone in February 2028. Even though at the time the official Artemis III target date was still December 2025, basically now. Shortly after that KDPC date was calculated, the Artemis III date was slipped to September 2026, simultaneously with a delay to Artemis II. That delay was announced on January 9, 2024. Subsequently, Artemis II and III were delayed again to April 2026 and mid-2027, respectively. One of the big picture questions is why NASA, and especially Congress, waited so long to react to this situation. Starship's schedule isn't likely to have slipped a year and a half just recently, but like SLS and Orion, it noticeably slides over time. There was some limited public discussion by NASA exploration officials about Starship dates back in the middle of 2023, but the space agency has been tight-lipped since then about the HLS schedule. Privately, though, SpaceX is in constant contact with NASA, like the other Artemis contractors. And NASA communicates with the Congressional Oversight and Appropriations Committees privately as well. A second race to the moon became prominent this year, with Congress escalating concerns in public that China might land the next people before the US. But concerns about the HLS schedule aren't new to 2025, and now that 2026 is just a few weeks away, the chances are that it's too late for any changes to make any difference. We'll see. The politics have changed a lot from 2023 to 2025, but there's the question about why Washington waited to make a bigger deal out of this until now. It's still not certain that any changes will take place. Even though it may be too late, plans are still slow to develop. Until and unless we get more information, SpaceX and Starship are still in the best position to be ready for their lunar orbit checkout review first. One of the other important notes in the report attached to the social media post notes what sounds like a December checkpoint, where SpaceX provides a new integrated master schedule to NASA for HLS Option A/Artemis III. That's suggestive that all the Artemis III programs would be providing an update in this timeframe, with December not much more than a week away. Maybe that means we'll finally get an updated schedule for Artemis III, but we're still missing a lot of pieces to the puzzle. Not just the Starship dates, but the dates and interim milestones for the other programs. SLS and Orion are still building the core stage and spacecraft units for Artemis III, and both SpaceX and Axiom Space are in development and test for the lunar lander and lunar surface spacesuits. In terms of the dates provided in this Politico report, it does provide some perspective on the Starship schedule, in particular about the time between those critical Artemis tech demonstrations. After the objectives for the ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration are completed, NASA was planning to complete the critical design review for HLS Option A. As opposed to the prop transfer demo and the uncrewed lunar landing demo being scheduled in 2026, this latest internal schedule update that Politico obtained forecasts a year between those demonstrations. Both of them will require multiple Starship launches, and then the crewed lunar landing that is a part of Artemis III will require additional tanker launches beyond that. This high-level summary puts 15 months between the uncrewed lunar landing and the crewed lunar landing, which seemingly is a more realistic reflection of all the choreography necessary between Starship and Orion and SLS, since the lander will have to wait in the gateway orbit for Orion and crew to get there. That note about a December update could mean that we will see this latest Artemis III delay become official and a new target date sometime next year. At the end of the week, the first version 3 Starship Super Heavy booster was lost during initial testing on site at Starbase. That is likely to affect the Starship HLS schedule that we're watching for Artemis III, or complicate it, or both. Even if some of the flight hardware can be salvaged, it's going to take time to get back to the position this flight article was in prior to the hull loss. Bigger picture, there are implications to the schedule, but it's hard to say there are implications beyond that. We've seen SpaceX mobilize and recover from previous situations like this. We did get an update from Axiom Space during the week on development and testing of their Axiom EMU spacesuits that would be used for lunar surface spacewalks on Artemis III. The spacesuit design is in the critical design phase of development, and on November 20th, they published an update about completing the first uncrewed thermal vacuum test. The suit is being tested in KBR's thermal vacuum chamber at the Aerospace Environment Protection Laboratory in San Antonio. The Government Accounting Office annual status reports in 2024 and 2025 have noted that a human-in-the-loop vacuum test is one of the milestones that needs to be completed for the suit to complete its critical design review. The CDR is a series of reviews that culminate in a final executive-level one. That appears to be planned for early 2026, but a date was not mentioned in this Axiom news release. Test articles of the suit have been going through crewed pressurized testing in NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Lab in Houston. NASA recently posted some images of Artemis II backup crew member, Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jenny Gibbons, performing one of those test runs in the NBL this month, and a dual-suit test run in the NBL was performed by astronauts Laurel O'Hara and Stan Love in September. A crewed thermal vacuum test is that next big milestone for the suit, and the uncrewed TVAC test indicates that Axiom Space is into that testing campaign at the KBR lab in San Antonio. But no forward schedule is known or has been provided. In other news and notes, on November 18th, NASA Stennis Space Center Public Affairs posted the video of the RS-25 hotfire test conducted on November 12th. NASA Stennis and RS-25 engine prime contractor L3Harris performed the 500-second-long firing of engine 20002 in the Fred Haise test stand as an acceptance test of the second new flight engine build as a part of the production restart program for SLS. New engines will begin flying on the fifth SLS core stage, and the first four will also serve as backups for the final Space Shuttle-era adaptation RS-25s that fly on Artemis IV. I visited the L3Harris Aerojet Rocketdyne facility here in the Los Angeles area back at the end of the summer before this second acceptance test and asked Mike Lauer, the RS-25 program director for L3Harris, about what they do in these flight engine tests. I assume that the intention is still you only want to have to static fire it once. Is it the flight engine? Is it essentially an acceptance test then? What's the objective?
when we do an engine test at Stennis?
Yeah,
it is. It's an acceptance test where we're characterizing that engine's performance. So the engine thrust level, the specific impulse. We're checking the calibration coefficients. So we're basically running all the new parts through a sequence to accept it, and once that check's good, there's nothing more we need to do. We go through what we call our second E&Ms. It's where we check mechanical, electrical stuff afterwards, and then we basically package it up and we store it in place until it's called down to KSE, and then when Bill gets it, he goes and runs the integrated checks when we've plugged it into the vehicle and the vehicle starts talking to the engines.
Mm-hmm. So I think I heard them called engine tags, like in Houston, way back when, from like a booster controller, that they have a sort of a knowledge base of what the engine looks like in different points in a main stage
for each engine for an engine.
Yeah, some sort of a baseline.
We definitely characterize the engines through that test, and then post test or post-flight, let's say, we'll check to see how that engine performed against our predictions and do comparisons there to see if there was any anomaly. So we definitely come in knowing what to expect on each engine given that testing.
Okay. Are there any other, like when I was talking to, during the adaptation, sort of certifying adaptation, and then into restart, we would talk about objectives when you're doing like retrofit 2, retrofit 3.
Yeah,
objectives for the
test,
objectives for the test. Are there any special objectives for the test beyond that? For a flight engine?
For the singular hot fire test?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. What I saw one of your questions was, it doesn't look like we're doing quite the profile. We do a few variations of tank pressures, because the vehicle will have differing tank pressures. We'll vary mixture ratio. So we'll check that works, and then at our low power setting that we do, which is the engine is spec'd to run at an 80% power level. We'll run a little bit longer at the low power, just so we can get time to see things stable and all the turbopump speeds and all that. That dwell at the lower power is longer than you would see in a true flight profile. So part of the acceptance testing is to dwell at some of these key things, change a few parameters, once again to characterize the engine in the kind of the corners of the expected box of flight, and just see how it performs in those corners. In real flight we ramp up to 111, well, for the restart 111, and then at about 120 seconds, just before booster set, there's the drop, and then back up to 111, and then taper off, obviously, at the end of the flight. Mm-hmm. So that's like a normal, that would be your true flight profile. Ours is we go all the way down to 80, dwell, make sure everything's checking out, go back, adjust some pressures of tank pressurization, go back up to full, 111, change some pressures and mixture ratios, check all that out, and taper off. Similar, but not exactly like a flight profile.
In the video of the November 12th test, we see a standard set of cuts from a standard set of cameras in and around the former A1 test stand. There are cameras positioned around the exterior of the stand, showing most of the steam exhaust cloud coming out of the flame bucket. We generally only see two views of the engine from inside the stand. One is focused on the power head. It's harder to see some of the components during main stage, but looking at the engine shortly after shutdown, we can more easily see some of the components on this side, like the pogo accumulator, low-pressure oxidizer duct, engine controller, and the LH2 low-pressure turbopump / fuel inlet, and part of that low-pressure fuel duct, among other things. The other internal view is the one showing another side of the power head with the high-pressure fuel turbopump prominently displayed, and obviously the nozzle. This is the view that shows us parts of the throttle profile when we can see it, and here we can see engine start. The engine starts and initially throttles up to 100%, just as it would for SLS launches and as it did for shuttle launches. Then, a little bit more than 6 seconds after the engine start command, this engine is throttled up to its normal maximum power setting of 111%. 100% represents the original 1970s rated power level for the Space Shuttle main engine, and over the decades NASA and the different instances of Rocketdyne have increased performance. As usual, the video cuts away to the exhaust clouds a lot, and in between cuts, we see the engine has throttled back to the new minimum power level for the restart engines of 80%. That's also the lowest power setting the engine can be run at in the test stand at sea level without damaging the nozzle. Around 160 seconds into the test, we see the engine quickly throttle up from minimum to maximum power, going from 80 to 111% in a couple of seconds. We don't see how the engine was throttled from 111% back down to 80% prior to shutdown. By the time the video cuts back to this view, we see the engine is at minimum power right before the shutdown is commanded, and then we see the post-shutdown purges come on to evacuate residual propellant out of the engine. At the end of the week, NASA Stennis Public Affairs posted some pictures of engine 20002 being removed from the Fred Haise test stand. The engine was removed on Wednesday, November 19th. It would have been taken back to the L3 Harris Aerojet Rocketdyne facility within the Stennis Federal City there in southern Mississippi. Also during the week, NSF NASA Spaceflight published a story I wrote about the recent visit to the Canoga Park L3 Harris Aerojet Rocketdyne facility here in the LA area. I'll put a link to that story and to my recent video about that visit in the description. Or actually, I kind of already did. During this past week, I also published a video covering a recent interview about the status of the Gateway Power and Propulsion Element, or PPE. Prime contractor Lanteris Space Systems powered up the assembled spacecraft bus for the first time in September and began integrated testing and checkout of its systems in October. Chris Coker, Vice President of Civil Space Programs and Robotics, leads the Power and Propulsion Element program at Lanteris Space Systems, and I asked him at the end of October to go through the current status of assembly and test and look ahead to the rest of the work. There are a few major hardware elements that are expected to be delivered to the Lanteris facility in Northern California by the end of the year. Redwire is forecast to deliver the 2 rollout solar arrays, and the last of 7 solar electric propulsion system thrusters will be delivered from NASA's Glenn Research Center. All 4 6-kilowatt Busex BHT 6000 thrusters are delivered, and 2 of the 3 L3 Harris 12-kilowatt Advanced Electric Propulsion System thrusters are on site for eventual installation on the aft deck of the PPE. Now that the government and NASA are funded by a continuing resolution, NASA Public Affairs at Glenn Research Center noted that the third and final AEPS thruster has completed its acceptance testing there, is boxed for shipment, and will be delivered in early December. As detailed in the interview with Lanteris, the spacecraft has begun systems testing at ambient conditions. Next, it will go through environmental testing to verify that the systems work in their in-space environment and under the dynamic and acoustic loads they will experience during launch. After that, a final phase of testing will verify that the extendable elements of the spacecraft deploy as intended after the quote-unquote shake and bake of environmental testing. If you're interested in more details about PPE assembly and test from the interview, I put a link to that video in the upper right, and it's also in the description. On Tuesday, November 18th, the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee announced they would hold a hearing to consider the nomination of Jared Isaacman to be NASA Administrator on the morning of December 3rd. The Commerce Committee is the NASA Oversight Committee on the Senate side and is chaired by Senator Ted Cruz. President Trump has nominated Mr. Isaacman to be NASA Administrator twice, withdrawing the first nomination back at the end of May. Although the confirmation process for Mr. Isaacman's first nomination was almost complete, the situation has changed significantly since his first nomination hearing way back in early April, and the Senate committee chose to hold another hearing. Senator Cruz met with Mr. Isaacman once again in his office, as they did back in early April. Mr. Isaacman answered additional questions for the record after that first hearing back on April 9th. However, those questions predated the preview release of the president's budget request for fiscal year 2026, which canceled all the government-run Artemis programs and pivoted NASA exploration away from the moon to Mars. Congress is the one that has endorsed and underwritten the Artemis architecture going back a decade, and they instead reasserted their support for the current architecture, providing money in the Big Beautiful Bill that was signed into law on July 4th. By then, Mr. Isaacman's associations with Elon Musk had already caused his first nomination to be withdrawn. Rather than terminating the EGS, Gateway, Orion, and SLS programs either now or by the end of 2027, those programs and the current architecture are now funded through Artemis V, effectively until the end of the decade. Mr. Isaacman's tentative plans for NASA back in the spring during the period of his first nomination were leaked in the days prior to his second nomination. Those plans aligned with key parts of the White House budget request, and now there may be questions about how much communication there was between the White House and Mr. Isaacman back at the time. Senators may also want to ask Mr. Isaacman what he would do to improve the chances that the U.S. will beat China in this second lunar landing race that Congress is promoting. and possibly some of the same questions he was asked back in April now that the situation has many different conditions. At the end of the week, Blue Origin posted about future plans for their New Glenn launch vehicle and an image or two of their first Mark I uncrewed cargo lunar lander in final assembly. In addition to some upgrades that will fly on the next launch, Blue Origin announced upgrades to New Glenn that would evolve it to a super heavy lift rocket in the class of Falcon Heavy, SLS, and Starship. The 9x4 design would have a 9 BE4 engine first stage and a 4 BE3U engine second stage. As I said at the top, the big question is when Blue Origin can realize the promise of this announcement and demonstrate what they are quoting as 20 metric tons through TLI. On Friday, November 21st, Jeff Bezos posted an image of the first Mark I lander after the 3 major modules were stacked, so the picture serves as a status update too. His social media post says that they will be in integrated testing of the lander soon. Looking at the image he posted and another one on social media, it's hard to tell if the lander is fully assembled. And then the big question for that is when the spacecraft will be ready to fly next year. It is supposed to be barged to Houston for thermal vacuum testing before returning for, presumably, final launch preparations. However, those interim milestones and the schedule are secret. We'll see if the lander can be spotted leaving Port Canaveral for Houston, and then looking for subsequent updates from Blue Origin. For New Glenn and its evolution, maybe we'll hear how those upgrades and the new version of the rocket fit into the possible lunar landing acceleration plans for NASA HLS and Artemis III. Thanks as always for watching. Like and subscribe if you find these videos informative and want to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. As usual, a big thanks to members of this YouTube channel who are helping to make it possible to keep doing these videos. I am posting additional content, including more videos and other posts during the week if you're interested in joining. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what I do, I would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.